Greetings, and thanks for taking time out of your busy lives to join us for an important discussion today regarding the upcoming report from some amazing students and researchers from the University of Guelph. The report, entitled Enhancing Municipal Capacity to Support Agriculture in the Greenbelt, is both relevant and timely, as our Ontario government seeks to move quickly on housing supply and overall development into the Greenbelt. We know how critical our Greenbelt is, along with our rural farmland across Ontario, and I look forward to learning more about the report and what this all means. Joining me today for this important discussion and to review the report are two of the original creators, Regan Zink and Wayne Caldwell. Absent are Emily Sousa and Elise Guichard. Also joining me is Shanley Weston, who helped support the most recent iteration of the report. And unfortunately, Natasha Gaudio Harrison was unable to join us today. I hope I've pronounced everybody's names correctly. I tried my best. I want to say thank you to all of you who are here and those unable to join for your work on the issues and this report that faces Ontario. Thanks for the three of you for joining me today. Before we dive into the report, I want to let those listening know that this interview is part of a series of interviews with students from the Rural Planning, Development, and Rural Studies programs at University of Guelph. Libro plays a small role in supporting the departments through the Libro Professorship of Regional Economic Activity and Dr. Ryan Gibson in his work. The students within this program and many more across Guelph are doing amazing research and work, and our goal is to help share that information with you, our owners at Libro, and community members. Regan, Shanley, and Wayne, thank you for joining me. We'll jump into questions now. So this research and report seems critical given our current time and recent bills within the Ontario legislature around changing the Greenbelt, focusing on housing supply, and overall land development. Reports and research of this nature obviously take time to develop. How did this research come to fruition, and what was the initial goal or demand for the research?
Great. Thank you very much for the question, Brent. I'm going to take this first one. And I just want to acknowledge and again, shout out to the students who have been working on the project over time, the fantastic work that they've been doing. Also to thank Libro for your interest in the research, and look forward to sharing the results. I think the first question is a really good one because it speaks to the challenges that municipalities at times face. And I think there are a number of ongoing trends that we at a municipal level are having to deal with. Over time, there's been increasing devolution of responsibilities from the province to municipalities, increasing things that municipalities are being asked to do. I think we've also got increasing trends, new things that are evolving, things like climate change as an example, things such as the changing nature of agriculture that needs to be responded to. That changing nature of agriculture speaks to the importance of agriculture within rural communities across Ontario. I find it interesting. I think people will often look to the size and scale of the agricultural sector here, and they don't recognize or realize how important it is in a national context. We look at what's happening in Ontario, but we think of the big provinces, Saskatchewan and Alberta, for example. And if one looks at the actual dollar value of production in Ontario, it's as great as those two provinces, and in fact exceeds that of several Atlantic provinces as an example. So we have a really important sector that needs to be respected and dealt with within the municipal planning context. We also have increasing demands for services on the part of municipalities associated with increasing growth. And all of this is happening at a time where we have different levels of capacity within municipalities. And we've observed that for a period of time. And that's part of what comes out of the study. But it's this recognition that some municipalities have good capacity, some municipalities have limited capacity. What does that mean for what's happening at the municipal level? And what does it mean for agriculture as well?
I think that answers the question quite well, Wayne. Thank you. Appreciate it. So I'm a big fan of simplifying kind of key context and ideas within reports of this nature. So I'm going to ask the question that hopes to achieve that. What is meant when you say municipal capacity in supporting agri-food systems, planning, and development? I'd love to hear perspective maybe on how we simplify that language and understanding.
Thanks, Brent, for that question. And I'll maybe start this off, and then if I miss anything, Shanley and Wayne, feel free to jump in. But before we talk about capacity, I think I wanted to provide just kind of an overview of what supporting the agri-food sector looks like from a municipal standpoint and the different ways that municipalities could support the agri-food sector, and give some examples from across the province from our research both in 2020 and 2022, which is just wrapping up now. But in terms of supporting the agri-food sector, so our project is really focused on planning, and planning can be viewed a variety of different ways. very narrow in terms of land use planning, and that would include things like thinking about what size of parcel supports viable farming operations. That includes things like what land uses are compatible with agri-food businesses, thinking about on-farm diversified use, what types of uses are compatible in terms of diversifying income on a farm parcel. And some municipalities are more or less supportive depending on their approach they've decided to take. But planning can also be viewed in a very broad sense in terms of all of these additional activities that maybe require partnerships with economic development or other parties outside of the municipality to support the agri-food sector. And so I'll provide a variety of examples from across the province. So in Ottawa and Huron County, both municipalities are supporting kind of demo farms where the municipality owns a farm property, provides it to an agricultural organization to do different types of kind of demo examples of new technologies, or some more sustainable farming practices such as soil management or cover crops and that sort of thing. And that's a way the municipality is supporting the agri-food sector. Another example from Northumberland County is the Agri-Food Venture Center. So thinking beyond primary production to what are the other pieces of agri-food systems, processing, cold storage, that sort of thing. And that's something that the municipality has invested in. And then thinking to other more broad things that municipalities could be working on in Chatham-Kent, there's a greenhouse strategy that's currently in the works, and that's thinking about kind of where are infrastructures within the municipality, where is natural gas, where is electricity, where do those intersect, and maybe the municipality could provide water in those areas, and all of a sudden there's this strategy for encouraging greenhouses in certain areas as opposed to others. And so those are different ways municipalities are thinking about supporting the agri-food sector, and that varies widely across the province depending on what type of agricultural activity is occurring in your municipality. And then thinking about, so taking a step back to what does it mean to have capacity to do those things? So there's a variety of different things that factor into capacity, and there's some pretty kind of straightforward or foundational pieces such as having staff. So municipalities across Ontario could have as few as one staff who's in the planning department at the upper tier level, or in fact, some municipalities rely solely on consultants. Other upper tier municipalities may have as many as 30 to 50 planners on staff. And so that capacity is very different in terms of having people, having bodies to be thinking about different things. Along with that is budget. So those are kind of the foundational pieces, but capacity is much more complex than that. It includes staff knowledge. Are staff familiar with agricultural issues and trends? Or is council familiar with these trends and issues? How supportive is council of supporting the agri-food sector? How does development pressures factor into this? And this is all part of capacity as well, along with kind of partnerships beyond, well, both within and beyond the municipality. So again, thinking about planning and economic development, how are those departments working together? How are those departments working with third-party organizations outside of the municipality, whether that be a food system roundtable, whether that be the agricultural advisory committee? All of these are pieces of capacity. So it was a very straightforward question, but capacity is many different things, and depending on the municipality, kind of the arrangement of those pieces will vary and impact the capacity that municipality may have. I don't know if I missed anything there, Shanley or Wayne, if you want to add on.
I might just emphasize the point you made around ag advisory committees, which I think is a really interesting point. Some municipalities across the province, particularly at the upper tier level, have ag advisory committees. And what that means, it's a committee that the municipality has set up, usually supported by planning staff, but in fact, the committee consists of farmers themselves. So when a contentious issue comes up in the municipality, they'll put it out to this committee and allow that committee to provide input to the municipality so that they make decisions that are influenced in a significant way by the farm community. Some municipalities have the capacity to do that. Some municipalities don't have the capacity to do that. And I think we can see how the outcome could vary significantly. One very positive, leading to input from agriculture, the other perhaps missing the agricultural viewpoint. And I think that's just a really good hands-on experience that that listeners will appreciate.
I appreciate both responses there, and I'll likely have some more questions around that capacity topic, Regan, Wayne, and Shanley. So let's dive into kind of data. So in reviewing the report and going through it, there's a lot of data and a lot of interviews that clearly took place. And I think it'd be great for the listeners just to know, so how was this data collected, and did you run into any challenges within the process? Also, also when I read the report, it notes that research was conducted in 2 stages. Can you explain the desire to take this approach and maybe touch upon the 2 stages a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess just to start off, I will kind of mention again that, like, as you said at the beginning, Brent, we are doing this in 2 larger stages. So the first one was looking at the Greenbelt area. And so there was 66 municipalities in that first part of the study supported by the Greenbelt Foundation. And then the second iteration of it right now is receiving funding from OMAFRA, and it's expanding it to look at the entire province of Ontario so we can get a bigger picture understanding. But there was similar data collection for both. So the first phase of that was a set of surveys, as well as some secondary research through financial information returns. The surveys, we sent out 2 different surveys. So the first one went to an elected official in each of the municipalities we were interested in. And then the second one went to a senior planner, or if there wasn't a senior planner, then someone in a similar role who would have an understanding of how planning worked in the municipality. And then that kind of let us get a broad picture, kind of quantitative understanding of some of the things that were going on. And then we followed it up in the second phase with doing semi-structured interviews. So not sitting down, but virtually meeting with planners from the different municipalities who had responded so that we could really contextualize what these responses were and get a better understanding of what was going on with them. As far as challenges, it does reflect also on capacity that there were some municipalities where it was very hard to get in touch with someone. There might not be a planner on staff, or there might be so few planners that had other responsibilities that it was just difficult to get responses to them. Regan or Wayne might have other things to add on to that because I wasn't involved in the first iteration of this project.
I think that captures it well. I think one of the things we ran into in both versions of the study was just around if there is very limited staff resources, or if the municipality is relying on consultants. Scheduling an interview is often a challenge, or figuring out who the right person to talk to who's kind of keeping track of those planning pieces that are happening at the municipality. There's not really a clear point person if the municipality is relying on consultants primarily.
As you're working through the second stage, which I believe is occurring now, and correct me if I'm wrong, with all the recent legislation and around housing supply, do you think it'll be easier maybe to collect data or to get those resources to reach back out to you and have those conversations? I'd be interested to understand if the changing environment is going to help or hinder maybe your data collection going forward. So
I'll take a stab at this, and then Wayne and Shanley, feel free to add on. I was thinking about that this morning, actually, that we collected data at I think a really key point. A lot of feedback. There's only a handful of interviews we're still hoping to schedule. So the majority of the data has been collected pre kind of all of this change that is happening right now. But those outstanding interviews have been really challenging to schedule just because there is so much other things going on that are pulling at planners' attentions and their focus, and data collection and research is maybe not a priority right now when you're trying to figure out what do these changes mean for our planning department. And so I think there's attention being focused on that. And if we were in a more central in our data collection period, I think we'd be running into quite a few challenges. Lucky for us, we did get that data collected early in the fall. So we kind of missed that period, but it would be interesting to go back maybe in a year from now and see how has capacity changed? Because we do have this really nice set of data from before all of these changes have occurred.
Yeah, and as I listen to Regan's comments, the word that comes to me, Regan, is uncertainty. And I think for municipalities these days across the province, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in terms of dealing with the new standards being asked of them by the province, new legislation. And we're at a point now where Bill 23 is just being debated. And not knowing exactly what the long-term outcome will be. But if those proposals continue through, we will see a situation where regions probably have less responsibility in the planning system, and local municipalities, townships, towns, villages, and so on, are likely to have more responsibility. And there will be a transition in that process whereby they have to adapt to that new reality. And we can see things like funding sources for municipalities being seriously threatened as well, in terms of development charges on one hand, but also the fees that municipalities often use to run their services coming out of application fees where municipalities must make a decision within a certain period of time, or they have to return the application fee to the applicant. And that's like sort of like a wow thing. Well, what do we do if we have to give away a huge portion of our budget, which may then in turn mean that we can't support the services we're expected to provide? It comes back to you and I as taxpayers. Those kinds of challenges municipalities are working through leads to all kinds of uncertainty. My expectation is the need for significantly more capacity at a local municipal level, notwithstanding the funding appears to be at risk in some ways to support those services too.
So based on what I'm hearing so far on the call here, and what I've read in the report, there's certainly lots of challenges around capacity. Maybe if you could highlight a few of the key ones, I think that might be helpful just for listeners.
Yeah, I could give a kind of quick summary of some of the challenge we heard about in 2020. But I also did want to, what Wayne was just saying around these legislative changes that kind of have this positive feedback loop in terms of all of a sudden, if we're not meeting timelines, then we don't have an income source or revenue source, and then we have less capacity, and it's just this positive feedback loop that is really detrimental to planning departments. And I think that's something that was noticeable between 2020 and 2022 is just the immense amount of pressure that municipal planning departments felt. And there's also a busyness that came out of a result of COVID and new development pressures and that sort of thing. But there are these legislative changes that are also contributing to that pressure that municipalities are feeling. Thinking about the challenges we spoke about in the report. So we had a number of different challenges, competing urban priorities being one of them, and that's come up again in 2022. Just thinking about where is council's priorities, where are the province's priorities, and what does that look like in terms of planning? Lack of staff resources. Again, those municipalities that have very few planners, it's really hard to have someone specialized or with expertise knowledge around agri-food systems if you're working with only a few planners. Thinking about assistance from the province and the need for direction around some agri-food policies from the province, and some municipalities feeling like they could have additional support or need additional support around some issues. The inconsistent staff resources is another challenge, or staff turnover within planning, and kind of the knowledge that is lost with that. It was something that's come up again in 2022, but was also present in 2020. And then relationships with the agricultural community was something that where it existed, or where there was an agricultural advisory committee, the planning department could maybe sit on the advisory committee. There's a much stronger relationship between planning and the agri-food sector, and intimate understanding of the issues or how policies are impacting the agri-food sector. So I think those are some of the broad challenges that have come up through this research.
I appreciate that feedback. It's been mentioned a couple of times now, just the relationship between maybe councils and local municipalities as well as the planning departments. Does anything need to change there before we start building capacity? And maybe that's a kind of a broad, big question, but I'm just kind of curious. That seems to be popping in my mind now that I'm hearing some of your feedback here from the report.
It's an interesting question. There's this relationship that exists between planning and community, and planning and elected officials as an example. And sometimes people will refer to planning as a necessary evil, right? Personally, I think that's a mistaken perspective on it. It's necessary in the sense that it has to deal with the growth and development that's occurring with municipalities. But I think it's much more than that. And it speaks to this need for a positive relationship and an understanding of what planning is all about. Because in my view, planning at its best is about creating better futures and better communities for all of us, the people that live in communities, for the next generation. It's making sure that we deal with the environmental issues that are so prevalent today. It's about dealing with the economic issues to make sure that we create opportunity for folks living within the communities. And it's about dealing with the broader social issues that we also need to deal with. And I think, where that understanding is fostered with the community and fostered with council and with planners themselves, then we lead to much better outcomes. And I think that's a long-term goal that is connected in ways to this research that I think are really important.
Certainly, there's lots of challenges, but there's also likely opportunities. I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the opportunities around municipal capacity and building greater capacity.
Yeah, so the opportunities that were identified were pretty reflective of some of the challenges that were noted. So as Regan was talking about having the high turnover and kind of losing some of that institutional knowledge, then we're thinking about ways to preserve that and making sure, especially where you have someone that has very specialized knowledge or one person who's wearing a lot of hats, they have such like a wealth of information, and making sure that that's not lost when they move on. So things around that could be like making sure there's a shared drive that kind of houses collective resources, having templates or standard operating procedures so that when new staff are coming in, they're able to reuse those pieces of information that have already been amassed over the years of experience. So they're not reinventing the wheel every time that they come in. And then some of the other opportunities were around the need to foster collaboration. So that was kind of mentioned already, but just like between different municipalities, between the municipalities and academia, and then also between different levels of government. So we heard from some of the municipalities in our current research as well about having kind of networks or relationships with other municipalities where they had someone to get feedback on, just like connect with someone else to say, like, have you dealt with this issue before? How are you handling this in your municipality? And kind of the value that there was in being able to have someone to turn to who understood the context. And then for academia, there's obviously a lot of knowledge that's being produced, but making sure that we're transferring it into practice in a way that is timely and effective. So it doesn't help if we're coming out with all of these huge reports that no one's reading, obviously. And so that is something that is being worked through this and incorporated into the project, is making sure there is that knowledge transfer piece where it's coming out with tools that are actually going to be helpful and increase that capacity. And then for intergovernmental collaboration, kind of, again, the importance of just having effective relationships between the provincial and municipal governments, so that the municipalities can implement the policies that they're being asked to, and they have the provincial support to make sure that it's being done appropriately. They have the tools and guidelines that they need to make sure that agriculture is well supported.
Shanley, you talked a little bit about the expertise maybe that's needed within planning and some of those connections to agriculture within Ontario. It feels like it's becoming an increasing challenge just across several sectors, not even likely in planning itself, but also we experience that as a credit union, trying to find individuals with agricultural expertise. Did you come up with any findings or solutions or ideas maybe around how do we increase that expertise within agriculture and then shift it into the key areas where it's needed? Did that come up at all in your discussions with planners? I open it to anybody on the call.
Yeah, I can maybe take a stab at this since I was involved in both iterations of the city. I don't know if we have any kind of suggestions for this is what are the next steps or how we could go about this, but there are the municipalities where planners grew up on a farm or are currently farming, or there's counselors who have similar kind of grew up on a farm, currently have a farm, or have extended family who are in the agricultural sector. There's a very clear difference in terms of the conversations we're having through interviews, the feedback we get through surveys. And I think that's part of our kind of work with knowledge translation and trying to come up with what is a toolkit? What does that look like in terms of these are kind of the fundamentals to understand about agriculture. There is, I guess, some best practices around getting municipal staff, municipal counselors out into the agricultural sector, doing farm visits, learning about different technologies that are happening on farms, learning about different types of soil management practices that are occurring. And these types of things are all contributing to agricultural knowledge, not that it's going to impact every planning decision that's made, but just having that overall kind of well-rounded understanding of agriculture and that connection, seeing a farm, seeing how it operates, talking with the farmer, that's all contributes to agricultural knowledge in maybe more of an informal way, but an equally impactful way.
And I might just add to that too, and this is a little self-serving in the sense that I'm going to put in a plug for our own planning program. So our program is focused on rural planning and development. And ours is the only program, to my knowledge, in North America that has that specific focus from a planning perspective. So we work with students, and as part of that process, they come away with a sound understanding of what rural issues are, including agriculture, how we need to respond to them, because the rural is certainly different than urban. I mean, there's similarities, of course, but there's certainly issues which are different. The geography is different. And the people have different aspirations and intentions as well. And I think it's really important that our students graduate with that understanding. And as part of that, have to acknowledge as well the contributions of the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, who, for example, have funded this research through the partnership with the University of Guelph. And that's really an important outcome, I think, in terms of bringing a rural and agricultural perspective to issues.
I'm just going to tag on there, Wayne. I had mentioned at the end of what I was just saying about the farm tours, and I do think that is maybe a best practice that has come up or arisen from our research and our conversations. And two examples that I can think of in this past year is in Niagara, Brock University was involved with facilitating and organizing a farm tour for all of the lower tier and upper tier municipalities, and counselors and staff were invited to attend that day. And it was a trip to 3 different farms, all very different farm operations. There was a lunch with a discussion time and some questions. And similar in Burlington, that was actually organized by municipal staff, but same idea, visiting farms, being able to ask questions to understand a little bit more on the ground of what is happening. And hopefully that can be something that's not just happening one day of the year where everyone gets to go out, but you can go visit farms anytime and ask questions or contact a farmer, call a farmer, that sort of thing.
Thanks for the additional responses and thoughts on it. I think it's an important question. So Wayne, you touched upon this maybe briefly around kind of the socioeconomic and climate challenges. How do we bring these connections in terms of rural agriculture, planning departments, urban, rural divides, economic development? How do we bring this all together to better serve municipalities? And how do we make sense of the kind of the intersectionality around all of these items? And what does the report maybe tell us specifically that we can use or consider to maybe better these situations and environments?
Yeah, no, interesting question. Well, maybe just to begin is to acknowledge that across the province we have different approaches to dealing with planning and different approaches to dealing with economic development. Sometimes those two services, if you want to call them services at the municipal level, exist interchanged, like they're under one umbrella and they have joint common interests and so on. And it's to acknowledge that sometimes often planning deals with more the regulatory side of development in terms of how do we do things in a way that leads to good outcomes, making sure that lots are appropriately sized, they're in the right location, and respects the environmental issues that might be in proximity to them. Well, as the development side of things is often about trying to encourage things to happen, right? What's good for the community. What I think links the two of them together is a reflection on quality of life. Because I think what both should be doing, it's trying to enhance the quality of life within the communities for which they're providing that service. So sometimes they exist under one umbrella, sometimes they exist as two separate departments that work closely together, and sometimes we identified situations where there's maybe not enough communication between those two units. So it's first at a municipal level, I think, to think through what is the right organization and structure, and then to stick to that. And I think just to give a specific example of that, of course, I spent much of my career working and living within Huron County. And if we look at Huron County, they've structured it in such a way that the two units work very well together. And the planning department, which has reasonable resources, has done good things in terms of stepping beyond that regulatory side of things. So, for example, there's a clean water program in Huron County where the county has substantiated over probably a dozen years now, put money into assisting landowners to make environmental improvements, fencing cattle out of water courses as an example, fixing up abandoned wells, a whole series of things, planting trees, a whole series of things that they've done, which I think has led to some really cool outcomes. And that's a really good example of the planning department working with agriculture and leading to positive outcomes. The economic development side of things has also done really good things in terms of farm tours, promoting local food, and building those relationships. In fact, the lead for the economic development side of things is a farmer herself. And I think that's a good example of municipalities dealing with these issues in a positive, constructive way. And we have many examples of that nature from across the province where the two units have worked closely together to create good outcomes.
I'm just going to add on there, Wayne, just because you were talking about Huron County, and actually in Huron, there is a staff liaison that between economic development and planning specific to agriculture, and that's not unique to Huron County. There's a few other municipalities who have similar, but it's definitely not common across the province either. In terms of this is something a municipality could do to strengthen that relationship between economic development and planning, specifically in the context of agri-food systems.
Maybe the quality of life comment, Wayne, that's an interesting way of putting it. Certainly we're losing farmland, and I think that's come up in multiple reports and a lot of the work that University of Guelph is doing in various types of research. And there's certainly a need to build houses. So how do we find that maybe that balance when it comes to both quality of life for those within an urban center who want to increase, not just density, but housing in general, and then also those who are seeking to protect farmland? How do we find that, that balance and that quality of life when it comes to both kind of populations?
That's a really nice question. It's interesting if we think about what are the urban communities that you might like to live within. And as an example, well, I spend most of my time in Huron County. For a period of time, we had a condominium in Guelph, and it was a 10-story unit, and it offered a fantastic quality of life in terms of the services that were close by. We could walk to restaurants. There's public transportation was close by. Could walk to the university as an example. And to me, that was all about a community that was trying to intensify itself, to densify itself, to create more opportunities. And if we think of the quality of life that exists in urban centers, it tends to be, in my view, enhanced by density. People sometimes think the opposite. If it's dense, who would want to live there? Well, in fact, the reality is, if you drive into downtown Toronto and you see all of the condominiums being built, the multi-story buildings, to me, that's one of the best things going in terms of protecting farmland, because you've created a denser community which places less demand on the surrounding rural lands and agricultural lands that are in proximity to it. So I think it's about balancing those two together, trying to create the best quality space we can within urban centers. And I think if we do that and do that well, it in fact avoids the need for sprawl, which, to be honest, runs a little bit contrary to the current legislation the province is considering. It runs contrary to that. It's about creating more opportunity for public transit, more services in proximity to where people live, better quality parks, and so on and so forth, which come from high tax revenue in a relatively confined space. And if we do that well, then in my view, we take pressure off of farmland. That's not to say that some farmland won't be lost over time, because the province is growing significantly and that places demands in various kinds of ways. But I think the notion of, if we keep that notion of quality of life, it also serves rural communities that might be losing population, and that has happened over the past and is forecast to happen into the future as well. If we think about quality of life, then we can avoid this constant chase of more development, which is perceived to be a need. I think if we have that focus on quality of life, it can help us in many ways.
I appreciate the additional context. So there was two iterations kind of to the report. There's 2020 and then the newer one on 2022. So it started out with the green belt and then shifted into kind of a province-wide look and research. Did you find similarities or differences or common approaches across the two maybe iterations and the two data fields that you sought after?
So I would say overall, our results were fairly similar in terms of capacity varies widely across the province. Capacity is dependent on a variety of different things, including who you have on staff, their knowledge, et cetera, and that changes over time. So I think that was very similar between 2020 and 2022. Maybe some of the differences was really around geographic regions that were considered. So the Greenbelt is a very unique area of Ontario. There's a lot of development pressures. The best agricultural land is also, or in terms of soil quality, is located in the Greenbelt. So there is this kind of perfect storm of conditions that led to additional conflicts that we're not seeing in other places in the province. There's also some differences in terms of maybe the support that different areas of Ontario see from OMAFRA, for example. Southwestern Ontario has excellent support, excellent relationships with OMAFRA. There was lots of discussion in our interviews around being in contact with an OMAFRA representative, having conversations if issues arise, that sort of thing, whereas other regions in Ontario didn't experience that. So I would say the main differences are around just how large Ontario is, how different areas or regions of Ontario are, and just the differences that has in terms of research. But yeah, capacity is very different across the province, both in the Greenbelt and beyond.
You talked a little bit earlier about kind of knowledge transfer and the loss from within certain teams and individuals. So when we think about maybe knowledge transfer and training, I think that was one of the items within your report or one of the callouts around building greater capacity. How do we make it a reality, and maybe what is next, and who's going to benefit from the research itself around some of your suggestions?
Yeah, so starting in the spring of 2023, we're going to be focusing really on those knowledge translation and transfer activities. So kind of creating resources that'll help bolster the capacity of municipalities to support the agri-food systems. So some of the tools are going to be a toolkit of best practices for addressing agricultural opportunities or kind of issues that arise frequently. There'll also be provincial-wide Agricultural 101 training material and a workshop to help build the capacity of municipal staff and councillors, as well as a cross-regional discussion forum that's going to be built on the Ontario Professional Planner Institute Planner Connect platform. So to kind of foster those conversations in different areas. And we also included, as part of the interview process, kind of directly asking the planners, like, what kind of tools do you need? What would help support the work that you're doing? And so we got some really good feedback from that about the actual things that would be beneficial that they would like to see. And so bringing those to kind of OMAFRA provincial ministries to help develop maybe additional training or tools, workshops, resource guides, mapping or software, things like that. And then in the long run also, like, we expect that the rural communities and the public are really going to benefit from this improved evidence-based planning related to agriculture and land use in the environment.
That's great to hear. I'm glad to hear that we're taking this research and building tools and going directly back to planners. I think that's a great approach. Maybe Wayne, as a career-long planner, what are some of the trends in municipal capacity, both from your research and your own observations that you're seeing today? I know we've touched on a number of items, but is there anything in addition that you've seen based on your data in this specific report, or anything else you wish to comment on?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to reflect on a comment that Shanley made. She used the word evidence-based policy, I think, and I just think that that's something which is increasingly important for us to be reflecting on as a society as well, particularly these days when we have such controversy that can occur around things where people might challenge the science behind things, or they may make decisions which aren't necessarily, reflecting on public media or, social media, which can sometimes lead to misperceptions of issues as a rigorous study might tell us is the outcome. So I think there's an increasing importance of evidence-based policy. I see that having evolved over time. So as new legislation's developed, as new bylaws are put into effect, that municipalities and others are truly looking at what are the outcomes, what are the needs, what are the real situations in terms of, how does development impact water supply, as an example, or how does it impact water quality? And that we base our information on trying to address issues with some evidence behind it. So I think that's really important. I think also over time, I've seen this increasing need to cater to the needs of rural and agricultural communities. Things continue to evolve. The farm I grew up on is very different than the farm that my brother has today. And, in our own community here, we have farmers farming 10, 20,000 acres. And whether that's the right outcome or not, people might debate that, but it's a real context that we need to do our planning within. So we need to be thinking about those kinds of issues, and I think that's changed over time. And I might finally say something about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as the old saying goes. And I say that from the point of view that planning done well is thinking to the future, and it's doing preventative measures to make sure that we have quality outcomes over time. And it's much easier, for example, if we think of a new subdivision, it's much easier to design it properly from a water and septic context, as an example, than it is to address that retroactively. It's relatively cheap if you do it up front. It's incredibly expensive if you have to do it after the fact, if things weren't done quite right. And that gets repeated over and over and over again with virtually every decision that municipalities might make connected to new development. So I think that whole notion of doing things well, thinking it through, based on quality information, is what we need to be aiming for, building on what's happened in the past and where we're going into the future.
Curious, have you come up against any roadblocks within trying to get your report out there or sharing the infinite information? I know you talked about kind of evidence-based approaches and some of the challenges that I'm sure academia and others are facing when it comes to evidence-based items nowadays. Is that a challenge? Is that a roadblock? Have you come up against that at all?
Well, from a data collection, I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering your question, but from a data collection, people are really busy. And I think it's to the point of, if you're, and it's this difference between some communities that have established capacity that they can take the time to think about things versus others that are maybe on a treadmill. They have to get the next application processed, right? They just need to keep moving along because it's so incredibly busy. And we see examples of this, and Regan and Shanley may be able to share some of the results. But municipalities having double or triple the number of applications that they had as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, partially a function of COVID and the outcomes of that, but also a function of the new pressures for development that are happening within the province. And I see that just being increasingly challenging. So those kinds of roadblocks are simply a function in some ways of capacity. People were really willing to contribute to our research and really interested in it, but there are some real issues. Regan, Shanley, feel free to jump in with any other perspectives you would add to that.
Maybe for clarity, I was thinking more along the lines of the general public or kind of the municipal councils. Have you hit any roadblocks on that front where people are pushing back and saying, I don't agree with the data, I don't agree with what you're putting into this report? I'm always curious about that perspective, if as researchers you ever come across that.
Not with this particular study that I can think of. I think people are really interested in the results because it gives them the ability to compare with others, right, and to see what's going on. Just as a specific example, earlier in our conversation, it was reflection on the organizational memory of a municipality and what exists. And we have examples. I was recently speaking to one of my former students who's working with the county, and with 2 years of experience, he was all of a sudden the most senior person in his department. I mean, that's an incredible amount of responsibility to place on someone's shoulders who is still learning the craft, right? Still learning the profession. And, all of the complex financial issues that municipalities have to deal with out of planning versus other counties and regions. And I'm thinking of Huron as an example, where I spent much of my career. The director of the department has been there for probably 30 years, and several other staff there with similar kinds of experience. And that legacy, if you like, of having lots of experience working within the community, I think is incredibly valuable, just as it would be with any business or industry, in terms of having people that can reflect, oh, that's what we did 15 or 20 years ago, and that's what we can learn from it as it relates today. And I think that's just incredibly valuable.
That's great to hear.
I have an observation to maybe add to that, and that's just around how staff are viewing their role. And that's something that's come up through the interviews when we ask questions around how are you supporting the agri-food sector? What types of initiatives are there at your municipality that are supporting the agri-food sector? And the responses can vary in terms of how kind of limited, or going back to what I was saying at the start of this conversation around a more narrow approach to planning, land use planning, processing applications, having an official plan, having the zoning bylaw, and that is planning, versus municipalities who are thinking about a greenhouse strategy and how can we encourage greenhouse development in areas that would be strategic for the municipality. And so there is a noticeable difference when we're interviewing staff just around how and it may be a result of planning education. It may be a result of the municipality you're located in and kind of what council is asking of staff as well, or what is kind of accepted as activities that fall within planning. But there is definitely, I don't know if it's a barrier, but it's something that's come up through interviews and is definitely presents a challenge in terms of thinking about supporting agri-food systems.
If I might, Regan, a fun example of that is, again, I'll reflect on Huron County, and this would go back, it must be 15 years ago now, at least. First of all, to acknowledge that historically there was never a grape industry within Huron County. There were no wineries, there were no state wineries or anything of that nature. And the county, in partnership with a local restaurateur, if that's the right terminology, said, okay, well, let's look at this issue. And they did studies on temperature and climate and the effects of Lake Huron, and came away with the conclusion that, in fact, grapes were very viable here. And as a result, today, I think, I've kind of lost track, but there's probably 5 or 6 wineries have been established. And to me, that's a really good example of the county, through planning and development, taking leadership in this area, doing the work, turning it over to the private sector, convincing people that this was a good thing to do, with really fine outcomes as a result in terms of new development happening in a way that really supports agriculture and the local community.
I will just also add, when I'm thinking about budget and staff resources, that contributes to kind of their perspectives or approaches to planning to support the agri-food sector. That's a very real barrier in terms of, is there staff time to put towards an additional initiative that's not kind of the core central mandated planning activities.
Very fascinating. Maybe just to kind of bring all the conversation today to maybe kind of a final question here. What are some of the takeaways that you hope readers and viewers get from both this discussion and the report itself? If there's a couple you want to highlight, I think this would be a great time to do so.
Yeah, I can start that off. So I guess one big piece would be that planning is just like one piece of the thriving agri-food sector. So this was touched on in a bunch of our other things, like Wayne talking about the importance of planning in ECDEV, or talking about the different like intergovernmental collaboration. Everything needs to work together to support the agri-food system. And so understanding kind of how those relationships play out and how we can support them is important for this.
And then if I'm thinking of kind of one takeaway, I'm thinking back to Wayne's comments about intensification really being supportive of farmland protection or of the agri-food sector. And I think recognizing that, yes, the agri-food sector is important, but housing and the agri-food system are not their priorities are aligned. Like, these are not mutually exclusive things. Policies can be supportive of both. And I think Wayne summarized it perfectly earlier in terms of looking at a high-rise tower or even the missing middle. So anything from a duplex to a triplex, a quadplex, all of that type of housing and supporting development that is a bit higher density than a single detached house, all of those contribute to farmland protection, to the
Oh, did we lose? Oh, Regan's back. Perfect. I thought I lost you for a second.
Oh no. What was the last thing you caught? Was it a
You're just talking
idea?
about you're talking about detached housings and the contribution to protection, and then you stop there. So
Okay,
missing middle.
much
Maybe
the
if you want
end
to start
of.
up on the missing middle, maybe if you want to
Okay,
start there
yeah.
again.
So just it doesn't only have to be high rises. It can be all of the different types of mid-density housing options that are also supportive of the agri-food sector, of having a strong agri-food system in Ontario.
This is a good reminder that we are live and these things happen, so it's all good.
Well, I'm just thinking, Brent, it's a perfect example, notwithstanding Regan, I believe, is in Guelph at the moment, but it's a perfect example of the importance of broadband in rural communities as well, even though I'm in a rural community at the moment on a farm and have great service, whereas sometimes that's not always the case in urban centers. But I think a third point just to acknowledge, and as part of this is to say at the outset, is it's to absolutely understand that when we have productive agriculture, it's a result of farmers who are professional, know their craft, and do fantastic work. I mean, it starts from there. But there is an important role for municipalities in terms of monitoring development, coordinating development, and working with agriculture as part of that. And then that to me speaks about, why is it important to protect farmland? Well, it's important to protect farmland because it provides services in very fundamental ways to all of us who live within all of us. We all like to eat, we need to eat. And there's a really important relationship there. And I think that if anything, I would hope that folks go away with an appreciation for the studies to say there is a role for municipalities. If you want agriculture to thrive and prosper, municipalities can facilitate that by doing things well, respecting agriculture in terms of development, making sure that we're not prematurely giving away farmland to urban development, that we're protecting it as best as we can, that we're acknowledging there's a whole series of tools that municipalities use, from minimum distance separation formulas, for example, which calculate how far away a barn should be from a house, that leads to quality of life or quality development on the agricultural landscape as well, that we protect natural spaces, and those are all part of what's important in a rural community as well. It's not it's not 100% agriculture 100% of the time, but there are needs for small hamlets and villages to thrive. There's a need for protecting natural spaces. There's a whole series of things there, and planning plays a really important role in coordinating that. And I just would hope people would come away saying, yes, planning is really key because it helps us achieve a better community.
I think that's a great way to end the conversation. Wayne, Regan, Shanley, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy work lives and professional and research lives to join me and Libro today, just to talk about this amazing report around municipal capacity and within planning. I appreciate it.
Thanks again.
What I'll look to do, just for those who are listening, is we'll make sure we include both iterations of the report once they're all available, and we'll include that on the webpage where this video will be housed. And any additional resources that Regan, Wayne, or Shanley want to share, we'll make sure we also include that on the webpage, as well as some contact information. If you want to reach out to these amazing, wonderful people, they're experts in their area. I think it'd be a great opportunity to connect both on the report or any other conversations or ideas you might have for them. So we'll include that as well. Thanks so much, and we'll end the recording there.